Over to the cloud. Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Smithers Quality Assessments Division Virtual Quality Conference 2020. We're so glad you could join us today for our topic of ISO risk management and business continuity in a post-COVID-19 world. Our speaker today is Dale Isaacs. Dale is an engineer with over 35 years experience with management systems. He is a past owner of a multi-million-dollar manufacturing company and still has a consulting company he's operated for nearly 30 years. In addition to his expertise and experience, Dale currently holds the position of Secretary of TC-176, the U.S. Technical Advisory Group of the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, responsible for developing the ISO 9001 family of management system standards. He is also the Secretary for the U.S. Standards Planning Council and is the U.S. Chair of the Standards Interpretation Subcommittee for TC-176 and a member of Subcommittee 3, responsible for supporting technologies to TC-176. Dale, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure for me to be with everybody virtually. I wish that I could be with all of you guys live and in color, but I suppose we'll save that for next year. So I hope everybody is safe and your businesses are surviving and you're even getting back up to speed after this this COVID thing has hit us. I mean, what in the world has happened in the past 4 months? Over the last 3 to 4 months, the world's economies have gone really from wide open to full stop. It was just a few months ago, back in January, that we had the first confirmed COVID-19 case in the United States, and just a few weeks after that, the first COVID death out in Washington State. Well, when that happened, it took the S&P 500 only 22 trading days to fall 30% from its all-time record high, by the way, that we reached on February 19th. It made that drop in the stock market the fastest drop of that magnitude in the history of the stock market, eclipsing even the sell-off of the declines in the Great Depression. And 2020 so far, it's running the 2008 playbook, except this one is running at double or triple the time. The unemployment rate, I don't have to tell you guys anything, the unemployment rate has increased from the lowest in 50 years, that back in February, 3.5%, to the highest in almost 90 years. And then most recently, it, quote, improved to 13% in May. Over 25 million people have been disrupted and lost jobs. It's the fastest thing that has ever overtaken us. Now, there's only really two realities: the pre-COVID-19 reality and the post-COVID-19 reality. In the pre-COVID world, let's talk about risk analysis for a second. Risk analysis, if it was done at all, it was largely superficial, and it was only done because it's a 9001 requirement. I mean, let's be honest here. Most companies did risk analysis only because they feared that some auditor was going to show up at their place, ask them some questions, and if they had not done something with risk analysis, it would be a non-conformance in the audit. Really, what happened, a little bit more than just identifying a few risks and putting them on a list somewhere so you could show that list to an auditor. Well, most of the risk analysis that I saw as an auditor, a third-party auditor also, focused on past problems or general company market risks only. It typically saw action based on historical data and historical facts. Risk analysis really became a company activity that was focused on solving problems that had cropped up before, sometimes even in the same company. If it was done at all, then typically what you saw was a very rigid process that was facilitated by just a few experts in the company. Sometimes just the quality manager at a company would do the risk analysis, put the risks that were identified on a list somewhere, and nobody ever knew the difference. Pre-COVID-19, it was definitely, from what I have seen, not an automatic reflex action that was done by process owners on a day-to-day basis as part of managing their process. I'm reminded, Scott was asking me when we were talking earlier, are there going to be any Dale's rules in this presentation? Yes, there's going to be some Dale's rules. This one right here, Dale's rule number 22 says, well done is better than well said. Well, here's some actual risks that I documented in third-party audits pre-COVID-19. These are some actual risks. Now, I've changed the information. I've removed the company identifiable material so you can't tell what company it came from. But here's some of the best things that I saw as part of risk analysis pre-COVID-19. One company said their biggest risk to the company was finding chemical leaks in their bags. Another one said maybe material stored in a wrong location or incorrect material tag was used. No training on the corrective action process. That was a big one that somebody identified. Failure to identify leadership responsibilities, not identifying improvement projects. Failure to follow the operating procedures. That was seen as the biggest risk facing that particular company, or maybe failure to segregate defective material. I mean, really? Those are the most strategic risks to the business that people could identify. Well, if you look at that, it's really not a whole lot more than just a list of things that have happened in a company. Then the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Well, so in a lot of cases, the approach to risk really turned out to be risk identification versus risk-based thinking. Because risk identification had really been done only to meet 9001 requirements, again, let's be fair here, a lot of companies were caught flat-footed. Organizations experienced supply chain disruptions. Personnel got displaced. Businesses all over the country, really all over the world, have been forced to close. There really was not a lot of contingency planning, and it left people with very few options. Before I go much further, let me identify what I mean when I say risk identification versus risk-based thinking, because neither term is defined by ISO 9000, the dictionary, or ISO 9001. So a moment with Dale's dictionary, you can see that on your screen perhaps. Risk identification, when I say that, what I mean is simply identifying a list of potential negative outcomes. Really not a lot of strategic thought or long or short-term impact on the business. That's identifying risks versus risk-based thinking. Risk-based thinking, what I mean by that is really trying to seek to understand the business context and using risk as a basis for planning. Now, in my keynote address a few years ago, some of you guys that are on this call here might remember me talking about business context. Business context is introduced in 9001 over right in the front end, the first clause, 4.1. It talks about business context, looking at the internal issues and the external issues that might affect a company. So now that we've got the dictionary, Dale's dictionary, out of the way, now we're all on the same page here, and that's what I mean by identifying risks versus risk-based thinking. So Risk identification versus risk-based thinking. Again, if we're going to be honest, a lot of companies have approached risk from a position of defense versus offense. Scott, this is one where we talked about it before we've done this session right here. It reminds me of a Dale's rule that says you can only score 2 points on defense. The lesson is get on offense where you can score the big points, but many companies approached risk from a position of defense versus offense. They didn't look forward necessarily to what may happen, but they looked backwards perhaps at what did happen and made a simple list of things. Remember, it's a requirement in 9001. The reference is right in the center of the screen right there, clause 511D. It does require top management to, quote, promote the process approach and risk-based thinking. That's a requirement of 9001. Well, to be fair, I mean, I've run multiple businesses in the past. I had my own manufacturing company. And when you're trying to run your own business, you're trying to prepare for every conceivable thing that might happen. But I think also, to be fair, few of us, I wish that we were all together in the same room this year. I would have everybody raise their hand. Who in here could have imagined that we were going to have to prepare for a pandemic that was global in nature? It struck swiftly, broadly, and to this date, there's no clear end point in sight. So first, what do we need to do about it? And then we'll talk about how can ISO 9001 help. First, what we need to do is we need to continue using that fast twitch muscle, the reflex muscle that we've been using the last 60 or so days, and couple that with risk-based thinking. Now, when I say that fast twitch reflex muscle, some of you have been athletes in the past, and you know that the best global world-class athletes develop that fast twitch reflex muscle. If they're a sprinter, it's the sprinter that gets out of the blocks the quickest. If you're playing baseball, it's the one that can get around on the ball the fastest. That's that fast twitch reflex muscle. And we've done pretty good at developing that over the past 30, 60, 90 days, I believe. Well, the problem with that fast twitch muscle is that functional-based organizations really were never built to handle the situations that we're facing today. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see what some typical functional department, well, that's what I mean, functional-based organizations. They're based on departments. We have an order entry department, a sales department, a production department, a purchasing department, an accounting department. That's what I mean when I say the functional-based organizations. Well, those types of organizations, they're really pretty good at topic expertise and pattern recognition. They do a few things and they really kind of do them pretty well. What we really need to do is develop that fast twitch reflex muscle. We need generalized problem solving across really a wide array of topics. What some of the functional organizations are good at is fact-based decision making. Leaders can drive actions based on commonly accepted sets of facts. What we need to be doing is developing hypothesis-based decision making. I mean, really, by the time the facts are available, it's already too late to respond. I mean, if you think back over the past couple of months. Functional organizations, they have a commitment to a path forward based on consensus, reaching consensus across a large swath of leaders inside the organization. Well, perhaps in the future, one of the things that we need is to place a higher value on speed of action over consensus about the action. They're pretty good at functional department-based management, but what companies really need to be is managed by processes and managed by systems. So the takeaway for this is process focus over function focus. So can 9001 help us at all? Well, actually it can. A couple of clauses we'll take a look at right now. Clause 441 and 6.1, they provide a lot of help for us. If you have your 9001 standard handy, that would be a good thing to have during this talk right here. But if you don't, I've copied and pasted clause 4.4.1 from 9001 on the screen right here in front of you, and you'll recognize that as copied and pasted right out of the standard. This is the section right here that really sets up the entire management system, okay? And you'll recall that early in 4.4.1, it says you'll establish, implement, maintain a management system. And then you'll figure out the processes in the second paragraph. And then it gives you a list of shalls, A, B, C, D, E, all the way down the page right there of here's what you shall do. Well, you may remember from my talk last year that we did a little wordsmithing. One of the mistakes I made actually in last year's talk, I assumed that people were in my previous session and would recognize some of this stuff, but there were a lot of new people in last year's session. I bet there's a lot of new people in today's session. So let me really quickly go through what we did. We did a little wordsmithing on the standard, and we crossed a few words out and did some rewording to make the standard a little bit easier to understand. That second paragraph in 441 now reads, the organization shall determine the processes needed to run the business. Now that's a little bit easier to understand. And it goes on to say, it'll also talk about their application throughout the organization. Now that word throughout right there, what that means is exactly what it says. From front to back, side to side, top to bottom, input to output. Now that, you might recall from last year's session, is big Q thinking. Remember there was little Q thinking and big Q thinking? We'll talk about that more here in just a minute. Little Q thinking quality, little Q thinking is only applying perhaps 9001 only to the production processes. Well, that's okay, but if you think big Q, that's where you're applying 9001 requirements across the entire business, throughout the business. Well, one of the other things that we did last year to make things easier, and I've gotten a bunch of comments from everybody that has seen me do this, the 9 steps. A couple of years ago, I did a talk on everything I needed to know about business I learned from clause 4.4. Well, those 9 steps, the first step was what we just looked at right there, determine the processes needed to run the business and how they apply throughout the organization. You'll see the references over on the right-hand side of each one of these bullets. That's from clause 4.4.1. It's actually the second paragraph. So the first thing at my company that I'm going to do is figure out the processes that are required to run the business. We'll go into some detail on that here in just a minute. The second thing that we'll do, after we have determined the processes needed to run the business, then we will assign responsibilities and authorities for those processes. That's called process owners. That's in 4.4.1E. Now look what I'm doing here. I'm reshuffling the order that these are presented in to make it a little bit more logical for us. So first thing, what are the processes? Second thing, assign process owners. I mean, who's going to have a more vested interest in this thing working right than the process owners? They're the ones that have to do it every day, right? The third thing, get top management along with the process owners to figure out the sequence and interaction of those processes. That's 441B. What sequence do they happen in? How do those processes interact together? The fourth thing, get the process owners to figure out the inputs that are required and the outputs that are expected from their process. They've got a vested interest in doing it, as opposed to getting somebody like maybe the quality manager to figure out all the processes that are required. If I use that approach, that's like me having Scott go out and work out for me. Well, after about 6 months, Scott's looking pretty good and I die of the heart attack, and that does me no good whatsoever. So first, determine the processes, assign process owners in step 2, figure out sequence and interaction in the 3rd step, then have the process owners figure out the inputs and the outputs from their own processes. And we'll look at that more in depth here in just a second. 5th, get the process owners to address, here it is, risk, as well as opportunities with the inputs and the outputs of their process. That's 4.4.1F. The 6th thing, determine and apply the criteria and the methods needed to ensure that the processes actually work. And that includes developing any documented information, procedures, work instructions, forms, checklists, that kind of thing. Who does step 6? The process owners. They're probably doing it already because they're tired of getting top management to beat their brains out. So they're probably doing it already. This just puts it to the next level, the 7th step. Figure out and provide the resources that are needed for my process. Again, who has a more vested interest than me, the process owner? The answer is nobody. The 8th step is probably one of the more powerful tools in management's toolbox. It's the audit tool. Go and audit the processes frequently to make sure that they work. That's 4.4.1G. And then finally, the 9th step is the continual improvement piece. You're continually, who's doing it? The process owners. They're continually making improvements to the processes to make sure that the processes run throughout the business. Now, let's take a look a little bit more in depth at that first step. Figure out the processes needed to run the business and how they apply throughout the organization. Well, here's a diagram that I put up. There's the big Q versus the little q thinking. If you look at the top of the screen, typical little q thinking applies this maybe to only the production processes. Well, you're missing out on a lot of advantage. Big Q thinking looks throughout the business. I've listed some right here. There's 3 typical ways that you can slice and dice all of the processes in your business. You can have customer-focused or customer-oriented processes, those processes that are focused on the customer. The second one is management-oriented process. You see some of those right here, the planning process, the context, internal and external issues that affect the business, who the interested parties are, internal audit and management review. And the third one is the support processes, the people management, the organizational knowledge, measurement and metrology and competence. Okay? Well, let's take a look at one of the processes. I'll take that first line, the customer-oriented line right there. And again, there's no magic to this. Perhaps some of you might have some of these same processes. They're probably called different things in your industry or your different sector. You've got the quote process, the order entry process, design, purchasing, production, distribution, shipping, and then final billing. Look at it as how an order flows through the business. Let's take a look at one of those processes. Let's say we're going to look at our purchasing process, for example, and I am the purchasing process owner. Well, in an average company, who would I be? Probably the purchasing manager. So we'll take a look at that one process right there, and then we will apply risk-based thinking to that process. Well, ISO Clause 6.1, again, that's a lot of help to us. And you might remember me talking about that, especially if you look at 6.1.2. It talks about the organization shall plan actions to address risks and opportunities and how to integrate the actions into the processes and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions. Well, there's some key words in there. And if you circle just 3 or 4 of those key words and then connect the dots with arrows, clause 6.1 now reads like this. An organization shall plan how to integrate risk-based actions into the processes required to run the business. Who does it? The process owners do it, because they've got that vested interest in making sure their process works the way it's supposed to work. And here's one way right here to apply risk-based thinking to my particular process. Again, let's take that purchasing process owner as an example. For each process, we're going to apply risk-based thinking. We're going to take a look at inputs and outputs for my particular process. Some of you guys might recognize the diagram on the screen, a turtle diagram. Some people call them input, output, SIPOC diagram. There's all kinds of names for this thing. Well, how do we use it? Here's one way to do it. If I'm the process owner for the purchasing or procurement process, let's just go around that purchasing process and let's take a look at how to do that. Well, if I'm the purchasing process owner, look at the lower left-hand input into my purchasing process. I'm looking at things like, do I require any process controls? Do I require any procedures, methods, documents, forms, records? What are the supporting processes? Let's see. For purchasing, a supporting process might be the vendor qualification process on the front end and incoming, receiving, and inspection on the back end. That's where you inspect what you bought to make sure it's what you got. Going around the turtle diagram, look at resources. What are the risks right here that my test equipment is not adequate? My computer systems, do I have any software, hardware? Look at the environmental conditions. If I'm the process owner for metrology, environmental conditions, the conditions under which I do the measurement, critical aspect. Maybe not so much if I'm the purchasing process owner. Who is responsible, continuing around the process? Describe the skills and the competencies that my purchasing people need in order to run the procurement process. And down the bottom right-hand side, the metrics, the measures. What measures do I have in place to show that my process is working the way that it's supposed to be working? Well, if I've gone through as a process owner and identified the risks for each input and each output, now think about this, and you get each process owner to do the same thing with their process throughout the business, now ask yourself, what's the probability that I'm not going to get what I think I should get out of maybe my manufacturing company, maybe my hospital, my healthcare, my school, my restaurant, wherever it is, where I've applied risk-based thinking to all these inputs and outputs. So what do we do with that? Well, I've got a risk impact analysis matrix. You guys feel free to copy it, steal it, and use it. I've presented it in past years. It's still applicable. I took our purchasing process right there at the top, and I identified 4 potential risks in that second column. Here's one that we've all experienced: supply chain disruptions as a result of COVID-19. That's a breakdown in the supply chain due to a natural disaster. Well, after COVID is over, we're still going to have tariffs. We're still going to have perhaps government intervention into the supply chain that might disrupt the supply chain. As you work your way down the matrix, we've identified as a process owner 3 or 4 other ones. There's probably a dozen more that I've identified. And hey, take note of this, they change over time. This is not a one-time event. They change over time. Well, working from left to right across the matrix, let's take our individual risks. Risk is a product of likelihood times consequence. Likelihood is how likely is it, the probability that a risk is going to happen, and I'm going to assign a number 1 to 10. 1 means it's not likely at all. 10 means it's almost certain. So I'll brainstorm where to assign the number. Again, guys, you don't have to do this. This is only a tool that I'm presenting for you. Feel free to steal it and use it if you want to. If you don't want to, that's fine. You don't have to do it. But working left to right, what's the likelihood of that risk? And then consequence. If you look at consequence on the top, right there in the center, there's a consequence to the risk to operations or to property or people or customers or maybe the environment, depending on what the risk is. Again, 1 to 10, consequence, 1, there's no consequence at all, you won't notice it. 10, somebody could get hurt or maybe killed. Assign 1 to 10 on each one of those aspects right there. Add them up, get a sum, then multiply likelihood times the consequence sum, that's in that green column that you see over there. That's going to give you a risk magnitude. A lot of people stop right there, but if you'll take it another step, maybe residual resistance to treatment is another way that you'll look at it. Remember, sometimes when you've had that sore throat and you've gone to the doctor and they give you the drug or give you the tablets to take, and boy, this is a bad infection, and I take the treatment, but there's a residual resistance to treatment. My sore throat, my strep throat, whatever it persists even after I've treated the risk. Well, some things have a residual resistance. You assign 1 to 10 again. 1 is a low residual resistance, 10 high residual resistance. Assign that number 1 to 10, and then you multiply risk magnitude times residual resistance to treatment. That's going to give you a final impact analysis ranking. Sort those highest to lowest, and then work on them one at a time. You don't have to do everything at once. There's a Dale's rule in there, Scott, that says time exists so that everything does not have to happen at once. Sort them highest to lowest, and keep in mind these change over times. I've done audits and gone back 3 years later to a company, and they've got the exact same, again, list of risks that they've listed, and they're not using them, and they're almost completely useless. Now, the process owners do this for their individual processes, for all the processes across the business. Now that's risk-based thinking. Now, most everywhere in the standard that risk is mentioned, it also mentions opportunity right along with it. So looking ahead, if we've done and applied the risk-based thinking, what are some of our opportunities? Well, we have an opportunity to link risk analysis to the strategic analysis of the business. Well, that's talked about in clause 4.1, where you're determining the internal and external issues that affect the business. Another opportunity we might have is integrating opportunity research into the business and its processes. How do you do that? Well, it's the process owners that do it. And they do opportunity research at the same time they're doing the risk analysis. I had to do the same thing for my consulting business when this COVID thing hit. The key, take an agile approach to business continuity and broader risk management. Develop, again, that fast twitch reflex muscle that we need and we've had to use over the past couple of months or so. The fourth thing, another opportunity that exists, is to conduct cross-functional risk interconnectivity analysis to understand other key business risks. Now, that's a lot of fancy words. Let me make it simple for you. Invite all the process owners to a strategic risk management review. And that way, all of the process owners see the risks that other process owners are facing throughout the business. A lot of times I've seen it where maybe the procurement manager, they've got a risk where this raw material, you can't easily source it. Well, perhaps the product development process owner is in that same meeting and says, hey, wait a minute, I can design around a different raw material that might be available off the shelf in minutes, as opposed to a lead time of months or not available at all. The fifth opportunity, develop consolidated risk reporting, including rapid development of key risk indicators. That's the metrics piece across the business. Reevaluate, one thing that we need to do, reevaluate internal audit and risk function testing plans to make sure that they cover the latest, in our case, the pandemic risk elements. That's how you make this work after the COVID-19 pandemic is over. Another one, assess new risks that have emerged that need to be addressed. Some of you might identify with this one, where everybody is working remotely now. Well, the IT people have now lost control of the firewall inside the business, and everybody is connecting to the internet at their home or wherever they're working remotely. And now there's a heightened risk of cyber security. Think about that, because new risks might have popped up based on what you're doing. Place protocols in place to aggregate and analyze emerging risks as the situation evolves. This is a constant thing that you do day in and day out. So a lot of you guys, hopefully you're reopening right now after the coronavirus. Well, one of the first things that you might want to do is conduct a risk assessment. And I put this slide in here just to help you guys as we start to open back up. Several states have opened back up or are in the process of opening back up right now. One of the first things that you want to do is identify the hazards now that exist in your business. Just do a simple walkthrough of the premises. Consider the high risk areas. Look at the tasks that employees typically perform. Decide who could be harmed and how they could be harmed. There might be some new risks that exist today that did not exist before you shut down. You assess the risk again. Look at the likelihood and potential consequences of each risk. For each risk that your business is facing, look at how likely it is to occur. What are the consequences if that risk does happen? When analyzing your risk, please don't forget, consider potential financial losses. Compliance requirements. You have new compliance requirements because people are working remotely right now that you might not have had pre-COVID-19. Look at business disruption risk. Harm to your reputation if you do have to close down, and other consequences. The third thing you'll want to do as you're starting to think about your reopening, control the risks. And there's a lot of different ways to control risk. I put 3 of them down right here. You can avoid the risk, you can control the risk, or you could transfer the risk. All of those, by the way, are mentioned in ISO 9001. One way is to avoid the risk. I did that in my manufacturing company. Some things they were too risky. We just will not do that here. You control the risk, take preventive actions to control potential risks. Risk transfer, that might be where I transfer that activity maybe to an external party, a supplier that can control that risk better than I can control it at my company. And then the fourth is monitor the results over time. Make sure that risk management is an evolving process. It's a continuous process. It's not a one-time event. That's what got us into the trouble that we're in, is making that little risk list that we talked about earlier. Once you've implemented a solution, monitor the effectiveness and reassess it over time. Remember, the risks that face your business could change over time. You want to take those proactive steps to minimize and avoid potential risk. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, that's risk-based thinking. And that will work after the COVID crisis, hopefully, is solved. And now we're open for business. Hey, thank you guys for tuning in and giving me some time, and thank you for tuning in to this podcast that I guess that's what you call it, that Smithers has sponsored. I appreciate that. Thank you guys very much, and my best wishes to everyone.
Thank you so much, Dale, for, again, an outstanding presentation. We're going to jump into the Q&A comments. So Dale, if you would be so kind to join us for questions and answers, we'd much appreciate that. Everybody, again, thank you so much for your time today. And why don't we get started on questions and answers? Thank you, Dale.
You're welcome, Scott. My pleasure. Thank you so much, and good luck to everybody out there.